So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our June POGO call. As you will just have heard from the robot voice, this meeting is recorded. What we're doing today is thinking about the people involved in procurement and contract management. So we spend a lot of time, as those of you who are regulars will know, talking about outcomes, achieving better outcomes in contracts, and also about including wider economic, social or environmental goals in contracts. And we wanted to spend a bit of time thinking about what the implications of this are for procurement professionals. What skills do they need? What role should they be playing? And what is the sort of outer boundary, I suppose, of their involvement? How do they get more involved in the sort of planning process and follow up, not just the immediate, narrowly defined procurement process? So we're trying to learn about different procurement teams and their professionalisation, get some different international perspectives on that set of questions, which is, in a sense, something that underpins a lot of what we've discussed on these calls in the past. So that's probably enough from me. I shall hand over to our first panelist shortly. If you want to contribute in the chat, please do so. We often have a very lively chat in these meetings, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions once we've heard from each of our panelists. So do please feel free to engage in a discussion in the chat, put your questions in there, or you can save them up and ask them in person if there's a bit of time later on. So I'm not going to introduce the panelists. I'll let them say something about themselves if they want to, because we haven't got very much time. I think that's the best use of it. So I'm going to hand over first to Lucy Sidney, who's going to open the discussion. Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Anne. So my name is Lucy Sidney. I work in the part of the UK Cabinet Office that is responsible for putting in place a new regime for public procurement to replace the current procurement contracting rules and defence and utilities rules following Brexit. So a big ambition to create a simpler, more flexible commercial system that better meets the country's needs for current regimes into one, all about delivering better value for money, innovation, requiring buyers to take account of strategic priorities, levelling up, wider social outcomes, tackling climate change, making it easier to do business with the public sector, tougher action on underperforming suppliers, and embedding transparency right through the commercial cycle. So it really is a wholesale transformation of the rules governing how public money is spent. There's a big focus on moving away from quite a procedure-bound system into one that provides a lot more flexibility for contracting authorities to tailor the process and the procedure that they use to match what it is that they're buying. So there's a real recognition that on its own, the legislative change will not deliver the benefits that we need to see. There is really an underpinning need to change for culture and behavioural change across that community of public sector procurers. And so my particular bit of this, I have colleagues who are very busy on preparing the bill, which is about to go to committee stage in the Lords. So we're just still at that stage of working out what the legislation, how it will end up. But in parallel to that, my part of the ship is organising the learning and development programme that will help support implementation of that regime. So our objective is very much around providing procurement commission professionals and others with the knowledge, skills, understanding and confidence to operate effectively in that new environment. And confidence is a really big and important word for us. As I say, it's not It's not just about knowing the words on the page and understanding what the rules are. It's very much, there's two real risks around this program. One is that people just kind of carry on, stick to doing what they've always done before, and fail to grip and take advantage of the flexibilities of the new regime. And the other is that people go wild with the flexibilities of the new regime, very quickly get themselves in hot water, subject to successful challenge, which of course will have a chilling effect on everybody else. We're designing the learning and development to particularly build that confidence for people to use the flexibilities appropriately. We're working with and through partner organisations right across the public sector, so it's a funded programme to meet the needs of different audiences right across the central government and the wider public sector, anybody who's bound by the rules. 4 key products that we're offering, and designing. One is knowledge drops, so short, fairly self-contained, high-level overview of the changes to the regime for those who need to know. Actually, probably primarily not procurement or commercial professionals who will, although they might be interested as a sort of primary to going into the more detailed training. But this is for non-commercial leaders, customers of the procurement function or the commercial function, suppliers in particular, of course, who have a real interest in knowing what it means for them. So these knowledge drops, a series of tailored, fairly short, probably around an hour. We'll do some short versions as well, just a kind of high-level overview. The main kind of product, e-learning, training product is an e-learning set of e-learning modules tailored for practitioners, so those whose day-to-day lives are going to be different, operating in the new regime. We're designing it to be about 10 hours, self-guided e-learning, certification module on the end, so to give people a really thorough grounding in all the different aspects of the new regime, recognising that e-learning is really good for some things, but perhaps less good for perhaps really embedding culture change. Then we're also following this up with, so for a subsection of those who have certificated from the e-learning, we'll be running instructor-led virtual deep dives. So we think there'll be, these are really for expert practitioners in contracting authorities, perhaps only a few in any small contracting authority, more in larger, but we'll go on following the e-learning to do a 3-day intensive interactive course, small cohorts, to allow people to really gain a deep insight across the particularly the tricky issues, and for example how to make best use of the competitive flexible procedure. We really hope that will support the hearts and minds change that we want to see. And then finally, following all of that up, communities of practice. So we will be leaning in and supporting existing communities and networks, and also setting up, we think, in those areas where there is no current forum for practitioners to come together and share their understanding as they have really developed their lived experience of working with the new rules, how it works, and what their best practice that they can learn from one another. I'm going to stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lucy, for those insights and for setting everyone else such a good example on the timing. I'm going to turn straight to Joyce. You're muted, Joyce, sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's it.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joyce Little, Professor of Public Leadership and Enterprise at Newcastle Business School. What I'm going to do is, if you'll allow me, I'm going to draw on some UKRI research that Rory and I are involved in, and also some levelling up research that my colleague John Shutt, who's on the call as well. But I'm going to spend the first just couple of minutes to talk a little bit about English local government for our people, for the people who aren't in the UK. The context of procurement then is that we have a very fragmented state. Lots of national and local structures have been dismantled over the last 12 years in local government. We have lots of multi-spatial delivery of public services. We've had 12 years of austerity, and despite what government says, there's no new money, and so as a consequence, we've lost a lot of personnel and capacity and funding from local government in some cases up to 40%. We've had a series of continuous stop and start policies, deal making between central government and local government, continuing under levelling up, and we've had very little evaluation of what actually works at the local level. And I feel, and I've coined this term, organisational amnesia, because in local government generally, when people leave, their knowledge base leaves with them and we're not replenishing that. And so it's a bit of a problem and then creates the kind of capacity deficiencies that we're talking about. So it's important to say actually that when we're talking about capacities, we're not just talking about people and financial resources. It's much broader than that. And I hope to convince you of that as I go through talking about procurement. So local government then is only one agency in a whole milieu of agencies at the local and regional level. And procurement and other offices have to work across vertically and horizontally across the local government and beyond as well. And so it's very difficult for them to think about being outside of their own functional area. So I think there's a real need to have procurement as a strategic core activity and get people who are able to work across the local authority and build the relational connections that are needed. So in order to optimise the capacities for bringing about social outcomes, there needs to be a lot of analysis of the ecosystem, making sure that it's healthy, and the supply chain. So to deliver social outcomes for communities, procurement officers need to be able to collect evidence from providers, develop contracts, and influence other organisations. Because they're working across the piece in a particular place, they need to be able to work collaboratively. Also, how they create value throughout the system from the beginning to the end, where they can identify value leakage as well is very important over the long term. The ability to support and shape local markets. This is really important in terms of developing category plans, ensuring there's intelligence and data for local markets to be able to access and stimulate the market participation. So everything that procurement has to do is the same as what local authorities have to do generally, is be much more innovative in all of their processes and systems, and optimize supply and demand, procurement and commissioning to achieve these objectives for localities and communities. The use of digital technology so that they can track activities, report on focused data, and have reliable data that everyone involved in procurement can access is really important. And this all leads them to thinking about behavioural change. So there needs to be complete overview of what we do in local government, from procurement right through to our service heads, through to the Chief Exec's office and the Finance Office and the Treasury and what have you. So working with others in the system is really important. How you develop contracts, how you contacts, how you collaborate, and how you work and influence the work of other organisations to achieve those social outcomes in a place. Also developing common standards across contract management so that everyone knows what their role is and how they all fit together. And there's a tendency for people to think that procurement is just about technical things rather than softer issues. And of course, within local government, softer issues, there's masses of them in terms of how you think about stakeholder engagement, developing narratives, looking for stories, looking for linkages and all that kind of thing. That could go on and on and on about, but we don't have time. But anyway, so we need to think about softer skills and rather than technical. So we need also procurement officers to develop new dialogues as to whether the system is working, whether the systems are fit for purpose, and where, as I say, value is created, linking procurement to other parts and beyond the local authority, understanding where social outcomes are being delivered or not being delivered, and if not, how can they augment what they do, and really questioning the procurement system altogether. Is it fit for purpose, and where improvements can be made? So it's about continuous innovation, continuous improvement, and looking at the system from beginning to end. So in conclusion then, I've got a few points to make before I really do conclude, but we did, as part of this UKRI, we did a Delphi study, and the top 6 challenges identified by key people in local government and senior people were need for collaboration and communication within teams of procurement and other teams, attention to learning and professional development, and our first speaker mentioned that as well, attention to the issues of leadership and organizational culture, changing the culture, how service delivery is not just about one particular agency, it's about a multitude of agencies, regular communication between local government and other agencies, and obviously collaborating with civil society and the agencies that represent civil society. What we found was that local authorities that were building up these capacities across the ecosystem were really better prepared to develop better procurement. Depends a lot on the procurement function, what the officers are like, how long they've been working, how much buy-in there is from the local authority in terms of the chief exec and the political leaders as well. Some have better procedures than others in terms of assessing social outcomes. And as I say, you know, they need to, procurement function needs to operate vertically and horizontally within the local authority. Some local authorities have assessed their procurement function from design stage right through to social outcomes, and they're the ones that are performing better. And a lot of entrepreneurial activities across public agencies, augmenting the technical skills with the social skills, for example, like you know, stakeholder engagement, storytelling, all sorts of things that we might get to later. So finally then, in order to create efficiency and effectiveness, the capacity issues need to be addressed. To increase risk and undermine progress. If the capacity issues aren't dealt with, it will increase risk and undermine progress of putting together contracts, and particularly on policy ambitions like the levelling up, where we're talking about, you know, fair work, net zero carbon, community wealth building, and a whole host of other social outcomes. Building the relational capacities and the systems capacities can help to get agencies working more collaboratively. And the human resource issues that were mentioned by the first speaker, training budgets are being cut in local government due to austerity, but there's still a need to recruit, retain and train procurement officers in all these new softer skills as well as hard skills and the use of data and capacity. The other thing that the first speaker said as well was about building learning capacity across multi-professionals, and I've got here learning sets or communities of practice or ways that you can bring people together in order to learn from each other. And the final one is the fact that in the better local authorities where they are doing procurement very well, they've built in informal networking capacities so that people are working within and outside of the local authority in the very dense networks of citizens, of communities, etc. And I hope I've kept to time, and that's all I'm going to say. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Joyce. And I'll hand straight over to Steve.
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Steve Schooner from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for including me. I'm ecstatic to be part of a conversation about human capital, which I consider to be the most poorly prioritized aspect of public procurement around the world. I've been very, very lucky for a number of decades to have worked with countries around the world on these issues. And based on those experiences and my research, I'd like to try to limit it to 4 points in the time that I have today. First, I think it's incredibly to remember that rules, prohibitions, statutes, and regulations do not ensure successful contracts. We have seen around the world, countries have borrowed the UNCITRAL model law. They have followed the GPA best practices, but you can use somebody else's legal system, but if you don't staff it, it doesn't make any difference. So, as we know, contracts are relationships. Relationships, like a marriage, are difficult to manage. Relationships depend upon trust, and establishing and maintaining trust is difficult. And it's something that we don't always think about thematically, and we don't train and prioritize our people to think about. Number 2, I didn't realize this earlier in my career, but working with other countries around the world, I have been heartbroken to see the most consistent mistake in human capital and public procurement is the way that people end up in our profession. We joke in the United States that this is an accidental profession for many, but in most countries that I have worked with, the people who end up in procurement primarily have training and background in public policy, public administration, and they are familiar and experts in governance, bureaucracy, and oversight. We see lots of people with law and accounting degrees. The classic trap in many countries is that non-specialized and marginal public administrators who are not on the fast career track are often pushed or shunted into procurement. I think one of the reasons this is so important is that what too many government procurement officials lack is private sector experience. They don't understand how the private sector thinks, and they don't understand how to communicate and build relationships with them. One of the most common jokes that we often hear in procurement is no one should be permitted to write an invitation for bids, an invitation for tenders, or a request for proposals if they've never written a bid or a tender or a proposal. And so we have found that one of the single best investments in professional training around the world are industry exchange programs. Take government officials, go and put them in successful businesses for a short period of time, and let them learn how their business partners think. Number three, the two most glaring holes that I've seen in terms of skill set and staffing around the world are on the front end and the back end. One is market research as a component of acquisition planning. Too many procurement officials simply attempt to replicate what's been done before, and the lack of creativity in market research makes them underestimate the market and not understand what their options are in terms of requirements or needs. Similarly, however, around the world, governments do not spend enough time or energy staffing and managing the post-award contract management process. In other words, they have a competitive process, they follow all of their procurement rules, they pat themselves on the back and they declare victory, and then they're disappointed when the relationship doesn't deliver on the promises. Countries need to invest more in staffing and training people to manage contractual relationships. And then the fourth point I want to make is one that you've heard before, and I expect you'll hear again, and that's the issue of risk aversion, which is the most significant impediment to successful procurement around the world. The best defense for most public procurement professionals is, I followed the rules. I didn't do anything that was illegal. That's process, not outcomes. And if we want to change culture, which is much harder to change than rules, we need to change it in terms of leadership, but we also need to change it in terms of metrics or performance assessment. Do not forget the truism that what gets measured gets managed. If your procurement officials believe that they are being assessed on not making mistakes, they will not make mistakes. If we convince our public procurement officials that what we care about are outcomes, value for money, customer satisfaction, did what you buy work and last and meet my needs, then we can change culture. The last thing I want to say on this culture change and risk aversion, one of the least expensive best practices we've seen around the world is recognition, awards, and prizes. Senior leadership should constantly be looking for good procurements, get those people in the newspaper, get them on the television, have them standing next to senior government officials, pat them on the back, and their colleagues will say, how do I get that kind of recognition? What do I need to do to get the special treatment? And that's the way we change behavior. I look forward to talking to all of you more.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. Very impressed with everyone's timekeeping so far. This is fantastic. So over now to Tim, you have the floor. Tim, we can't hear you.
Yes,
there you are.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was busy trying to reply to some of these fantastic chats that are going on. Tremendous inputs of Steve. I love listening to what you say, having spent many years myself also dealing with organizations struggling with federal procurement in the US. I prefer to think of this topic as a matter of competency, since I think we must avoid assuming the need for a specific function or particular experts to create capability. So what are the problems with procurement today? Many would say that those performing the role are too narrow in their thinking, too limited in their accountability, too constrained in their contribution, and that overall capability lacks coherence. And I think our previous presenters have really illustrated those points excellently. So in this context, is it procurement that's wrong, or is it a failure to look more holistically at the capability to deliver outcomes through or with external providers? And as we've heard from those other presenters, this activity requires coordination across multiple stakeholders. It isn't a traditional discipline. So why would we assume that procurement steps into that role? It's actually a challenge that I've been working with at Leeds University, where I was appointed to tackle that problem within academia, to create integration across disciplines and deliver true commercial knowledge and research. And you can imagine the reception that has gained. Therefore, I think we must give thought here to the question, are we seeking to fundamentally redefine what we mean by procurement, or are we trying to reform or redesign the current procurement phase so that it fits better within an overall delivery system? So among the challenges we face that have driven a need for reform are, I think, the massive increase in externally acquired goods and services, the steady shift from acquisition of goods to a predominance of services, which then leads to this massive shift towards a concern about performance and outcomes over time, and to Steve's point, absolutely demands fundamental changes to measurement systems. And we also see the continuing evolution of relationship types and contracting models, but with little thought, unfortunately, given to the organizational capabilities that are needed for their management. And sadly, I have to say that and many of the organizations that I work with are private sector, they are not actually necessarily that much better. So on top of those issues, the scale of market change and uncertainty that we face today require fundamentally different capabilities to assess, to contract, and to manage. Adaptability, agility, predictive capability, dynamic reform, characteristics such as these are rarely associated with public sector procurement, nor indeed with procurement more generally. And that's in large part due to the fact that success depends on that cross-functional capability and competence, a system of creative contention. So what do we need? As one senior official in the Australian government said to me, we could essentially outsource everything except contract management. And that's arguably the area of capability where we've made the least investment. I think few would disagree that procurement capability needs to change to be more adaptive and responsive, more effective at analyzing and replicating success. But does the role itself need to expand, or does it need to be better instructed and managed, provided with fit-for-purpose tools and policies? In a perfect world, I might argue that I want full self-service capabilities without function. Future procurement may well be fulfilled by people equipped with intelligent machines. So with this in mind, modern procurement should be an enabling and oversight function, equipping the organization with the tools and knowledge needed to successfully select and manage supply relationships. To do this, there needs to be segmentation based on the type of relationship needed to achieve the required outcome. That's because different forms of relationship require very different skills and capabilities for their management. Traditional procurement was strongly focused on input. Indeed, again, reflecting, I think, your sentiment, Steve, I recall a conversation with the former head of the GSA in the US, who observed we often undertake a perfect procurement and achieve completely the wrong outcome. Public procurement has been a rules-based system designed to support product acquisition. Now, even when the UK decided to reform capabilities, I'm afraid I feel it failed to grasp the point that contract award is the beginning, not the end. There's been some excellent work reskilling and attempting to convert from procurement to commercial, but post-award skills and competencies have until recently been largely ignored, and the transformation of existing thought and behaviours are at best patchy. Even where training has been applied, its effectiveness is constrained by the actions or inactions of others, for example, legal, finance, operations, or by the embedded assumptions of ministers and the behaviours they unfortunately drive, or the need of suppliers themselves. Leading practice, whether public or private sector, is to design for a full acquisition life cycle. And it's in this wider context at a recent conference that delegates recognized that procurement is just one phase in the much wider discipline of contracting. So I'd suggest that the question as posed is one that we cannot and should not seek to answer without first having defined and understood the overall contracting life cycle, from inception of requirement to delivery of outcome or termination of need. It's this capability that's missing, and simply fiddling with procurement may enable marginal improvements, but will not fix the problems.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. Well said. Over now, finally, last but not least, to Nicholas.
Thank you, Anne. So to finish off, I'd like to present briefly on one of the supplementary modules that we have. As you know, MAPS is built around 4 pillars that try to study, and echoing what Steve was saying, not only legislation, but also go into the institutions, the practices, the actual procurements, and how civil society and the private sector are interacting with the procurement market. And based on this, there's and even from the core maps, there is an emphasis on professionalization. MAPS, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the tool, it provides an assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of a public procurement system as a system. So that's why it's meant to be holistic, it's meant to be studied in all those dimensions. And it's something that provides for a vision of where to go with the system, including on topics related to staffing and procurement professionalization. It's important also to mention that MAPS will not provide you with like specific insights on how to build one specific capacity or to measure one specific skill of the professionals. I think it's more, again, based on the system, and after that you might carry out other studies to deepen the understanding of a certain skill. And in the core framework, we try to study topics such as from the institutions, whether there's responsibilities related to professionalization in the government, whether there's proper training, capacity building for the procurement staff, and also the recognition of professionalization, of procurement as a profession within government. So that's the basis of what the core maps contains regarding professionalization. Based on that, and hearing that many governments wanted to go deeper into this topic, there's one supplementary module that can be applied, and actually it's the only maps supplementary module that can be applied standalone. And that's important because it has been done, and actually in the pilot that was done in Peru, it was done even without having a core maps assessment. The rationale behind that is that although you need some context of the country and also of the general procurement and how it's working, the module focuses more on how professionalization is working in general. So maybe you would need more a context of professionalization in general in the country, and not so much of understanding whether there's a law that allows for a certain procurement method or not. And thus the module can be applied as standalone. This module contains basically follows the same structure in pillars related to rules and principles. Professionalization also regarded and studies whether it's really something that is developed within a broader capacity building strategy of government and not only for procurement. Also, everything related to how professionalization is planned, monitored, and evaluated, so indicators related to that. Competency framework and career path, again, whether there's an existing competency framework, although not studying the exact competencies and skills of procurement officers, but whether is indeed a framework or not, or one in development, and also whether there's a career path for public officers. Again, echoing some of the things you've said, whether those officers, why they chose to become procurement officers, and is there any way in which they can progress and advance on their skills, but also on their careers, remuneration, and responsibilities. Training and education market, and that's important because we don't see this only as something that is related to government providing those the markets for education, but also universities and other providers, and how they can actually provide those capacity building exercises and programs. All that relates to assets, academic degrees, accreditation, certification. So how is that working in the country? Also including whether universities are providing for any of those. And finally, also related to how the MAPS core framework is built, ethics, accountability, and integrity related to the professionalization of procurement. You might already know, but just to provide you with one example of how this works in practice, when an assessor wants to understand whether this is happening or not, there are indicators that are set up as aspirational indicators, so as to think that all countries should strive to get to that level. And if you think, for example, of one of the indicators, I'm thinking about the existence of a public procurement competency framework. There are some criteria, very specific criteria that the assessor would want to analyze, such as whether there's a public procurement competency framework that includes different professional levels and specialties, whether the public, whether this framework identifies skills and competency levels required by all key staff involved in the procurement process for different professional levels, and also whether the public procurement framework, competency framework, is suitable for conducting skills assessments, identifying educational training and development needs, and career planning. Alongside those, in some of the MAPS indicators, there are quantitative indicators that have to be gathered, including many of those coming from surveys that may be done to understand whether those programs are working and what's the perception of users. This has been used again in Peru. There are upcoming assessments that we hope to see starting in Costa Rica and Senegal. And based on this, partners, including, for example, in Peru, the IDB used MAPS assessments to work with the government on carrying out a full professionalization program, including improved learning and certification models starting last year. So with that, happy to discuss and provide any further information about MAPS.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all our panelists for saying so many interesting things whilst keeping perfectly to time. I'm hugely impressed. Well done, everyone. So now we've got, thanks to that, a good bit of time for audience questions and comments. So if you'd like to ask a question, please either switch your camera on and wave at me, or raise a virtual Zoom hand. And I might also pick out one or two things from the chat, sort of multitasking, looking at the chat, looking at the screen. Not seeing any hands yet. Steve, I think it's cheating, but go for it.
We have so little time and so many things to talk about, and maybe we can spur more conversation. But to build on a couple things that others mentioned, I think one of the biggest challenges that we've seen around the world are the concerns about what the body of knowledge entails. So we have enough difficulty determining who we're going to train or who we're going to develop. But what's happened, and we see it with SIPs, and we see it in the United States with NCMA, this suggestion that we can define the body of knowledge and you can be a professional and be certified if you know X. But think about how many of us just mentioned that rules mastery is insufficient. And so one thing that we know is we need more experiential learning and we need more professional development. And you heard a number of us refer to what are often referred to as professional skills or soft skills. It is remarkable how few experienced professionals in our field have strong skills and good training in critical reading, persuasive writing, interpersonal skills, team building, management, negotiation, dispute resolution. And what we see in other fields is there's a lot more executive coaching at the higher levels. In addition, what we're finding is we need to do more training on stress management and time management. So instead of simply training people on legal awareness and risk aversion, how not to get in trouble, we need to get them to focus on their customers and their outcomes, but also teach them how to be true professionals.
Thanks, Steve. That connects nicely also to a point that Elle made in the chat. Elle, I don't know if you're there still and would like to come in on this around the soft skills and connectedness.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. And I think it picks up on many of the points that others, including Steve, have made. But it was really sparked by what Joyce was saying in terms of this need for horizontal connectedness and this team sport element. I'm curious in terms of how do we know it when we see it, and therefore how can we best support development of practice in this space? So I'm curious as to kind of where are the areas of strength here, and how can we begin to learn and borrow? Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks, Elle. And obviously our panelists will have an opportunity to come back on that in a few moments. I can see a virtual hand raised by Jeppe. Please come in.
Thank you so much. I was typing this in the chat, but since there is a room for it now, I will deliver it in person. This is a remark to what you said earlier, Steve, about rewarding procurement officials for their services. I was fascinated by this. I think it's completely right. So if I understand you correct, what you're saying is that we should make procurement cool as a profession, or at least desirable. At any rate, it seems to me that this is predicated on the condition that managers would actually care about the procurement outcomes in their organizations. So when I used to work with procurement myself, we the foot soldiers said that one of the major problems was that, barring sort of majorly catastrophic cases, no one would get fired if procurement activities were inefficient. And So my question, I guess, to you is in your research, what do you see in terms of how you actually get the top management of institutions to care about this?
Great question. Thank you very much. I can also see David with a hand raised.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in terms of the questions with regard to connectedness, whether we have anything like the level of local data that we would need to actually transform public procurement, especially in terms of, we really look for modern methods, things like earned value management, that aren't necessarily in one contract, that we are truly looking to have a wider impact and measure that impact. Actually, how do we start to look at introducing those kind of different measurement techniques into the procurement process?
Great question. Thank you very much. I noticed there's also been, there's Joyce. I'll let you speak, Joyce.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to the earlier question, actually, about the connectedness and how you see it. I mean, I'm a strategist, so I've spent a lot of time working with local authorities, helping them develop strategies. And what I did with them was actually work on stakeholder engagement, just not stakeholder engagement outside of the organization, but inside of the organization. It was really interesting to find people who'd worked there for years who'd never met each other, so didn't know who did what. So I think I think you can see it when you have, I mean, I was working on a leisure strategy, which is a non-statutory responsibility for local authorities, but it was about linking leisure to health and how all of this could link then to economic development. And so it's kind of a precursor to what we've got now on levelling up. But what you can see it when you have an openness, and it usually means having 2 or 3 very entrepreneurial public servants, officers who want to drive the whole thing. And the people I was working with had come from the private sector into local government. And it's interesting the number of procurement officers that are coming from the private sector now working in local government. So I think it's a combination of having the right people, having the processes in place, and having a focal point, which would be the social outcomes more generally, or a particular service area where procurement links in with other ones as well. Internal and external stakeholder engagement, I think, is really important.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joyce. So thank you all for those questions. And just to tee up the final round from the panelists, you may also want to pick up on the discussion around risk aversion in the chat. That's something that we've talked about quite a lot in POGO, but how do you get procurement professionals to overcome risk aversion? How do you get them to feel confident, as Lucy was talking about using flexibilities that are available to them? I think there's an interesting discussion lurking in what's being said about the scope of procurement. Rory and I sometimes joke that we're not interested in procurement. And what we mean by that is that we're not interested in the sort of very narrowly defined technical process of awarding a contract. What we're interested in is, the whole life cycle. And I think there's a really interesting, definitional scope sort of question that some of you might want to address. And finally, abusing my position really, question from me. Those of you who've been talking about specific systems that you're familiar with, how big do you think that gap is between the skills that people have and the skills that are required? Are we talking about tweaking, or are we talking about major upskilling needs? So what I'm going to do now is go back round our panelists in the same order. You've each got 2 minutes for a quick reflection on what you've heard either from the audience or from the other panelists, fully recognizing that you will not be able to address absolutely everything that we've talked about. So Lucy, you go first.
Thanks very much. I'm struck by lots of different comments about the need for community and people learning from one another, which gives me a bit of heart in the way that we've designed our programme, that the communities are firstly the deep dives to really enable people to get under the skin of it, but the communities practice, I think the importance of that element of our programme, which is perhaps the the less formal bit and the more organic bit that will probably really deliver the value. I'm really struck by, and I will take back to the team that are developing the learning and development, some of the comments around that piece around do we have the data, are we measuring the right things? Because I think that is one of the things, one of the other elements of the bill and the new regime is around for every contract they need to publish 3 KPIs, and I think it will be that decision about what are the KPIs that matter most being about the outcomes for service users will be quite an important one. And do we have the data to know whether it's working? I mean, again, the transparency platform, if we get it right, should mean that there's a richness there. And then of course there's another skills-based question about do people have the skills to interrogate that data appropriately, to tell them what they need to know. So yeah, really interesting reflections. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm glad it's been useful for the major undertaking that you're engaged in. Joyce, over to you.
Yeah, it was just the thing that struck me listening to the discussion is that we do need more softer issues, but it also made me think about how we traditionally train local government officers in their specific silos, whether you're a legal person or a procurement or someone who works in health service, community service or what have you. The existing training does try to kind of get this multitude of sort of experiences with colleagues. But actually, I would be even more radical and I would move people around in local authorities so that they could get a lot more experience of different functions and different ways that they're all adding to the whole. Because local government are multi-purpose organisations. They've always been multi-purpose organisations. But the way that we train local government officers is very much still in the silo mentality. So I think the communities of practice and the sharing. I mean, I was a civil servant many years ago and we were all generalists then. I mean, things are a little bit different now, a long time on. But I think that there needs to be some way of interchange between different agencies in order to get the learning and the knowledge base. So even outside of the local authority, if you could have a system where you could have people from the third sector, voluntary sector, spending a little bit of time, or likewise local government people working in business, that would be a radical solution for me. But it would enable people to understand the worlds within which other people work and the processes that they're engaged in.
Fantastic, thank you, Joyce. And next up, Steve.
So I think what I'd like to do in my 2 minutes is mostly respond to Jeppy's question, but make a larger point. And what I heard the question being was, how do we get leadership or management to suggest that procurement matters? And I think the short answer or the uncomfortable answer is we need to encourage leadership to tell the truth. The modern era of government around the world is outsourced government. I was recently with in a program in Jamaica, a large procurement program where the Ministry of Finance walked into the room and in 5 minutes inspired the procurement workforce by telling them that the government depended on them. Governments around the world cannot function today without private support. The best example in the United States, not always a good one, but the best one, is that the military today, the United States military, cannot move, fight, communicate, or sustain itself without a fully integrated contractor presence. In the United States, the military leadership has been far more honest about our dependency on procurement and the importance of investing in the acquisition workforce. The failure to acknowledge the importance of private sector contribution to government function is a form of political cowardice and ignorance that contributes to the failure to properly invest in the procurement workforce. And maybe if we could address it at the top, it would trickle down to everyone else. Thanks so much for including me.
Thank you. And over to Tim.
I'm going to be spending a lot more time talking to Steve. I think we have to recognize that technology has transformed our world. But in many cases, it's also a major component that's constraining our ability to respond to the changes that it's generated. Much of my work at present is how do we improve and enable contract data management across the acquisition lifecycle? You know, illustrating the points we've been making about the fragmented nature, the cross-functional nature of this process, the average corporation today has contract-related data stored in 24 different systems. My work with the Department of Health and Human Services in the US discovered that for them, it was 39. When you've got that level of fragmentation, of course, decision-making is impeded, but also so much time of procurement, acquisition, contract management staff is spent trying to discover data or enter data into a whole load of disparate systems that don't actually give them any meaningful intelligence. So unfortunately, what we're looking at is the inability to look at either a transactional or, more importantly, at a portfolio level. So we never really have a sense of what success might look like. The gap, I would therefore suggest, is yes, in part, it is, of course, about skills and need for retraining. But I think it's also, in large part, that the procurement process has very often the wrong technology that's been designed for transactional, cost-based decision-making.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. And finally, over to Nicholas.
Thank you. And I'd like to start with what you were saying at the end is whether we've seen that there's a big gap or not. And although MAPS is not built to compare countries, I think we've already read a number of assessments and reviewed a number of those. So I think in many countries, this is certainly something that there's a big gap in terms of what is required and what there is right now. I think people, and we've spoken about this is really about people, and people need recognition. People have fears, people have things that they do best, people have things that they don't like, and this is really about thinking even from the institutional setup and also from the leaders, how to properly encourage people to innovate, to have a sense of belonging in their work and understand the impact of their work. It's not just creating a contract or revising a clause, but really moving the things required to provide for students to go to school, providing the necessary health supplies for people to be healthy. So that's, I think, one of the key elements that is still missing. And I guess it also goes back to the fact, as Jeppe was saying, about no one gets fired, and I think there might be different views from different countries about that. I think I relate to Sean's message there. I can tell you about the Latin American context. Before I was in the economic procurement agency, and there's a lot of difficulties about officers in how they relate to procurement because of the fears they have. And something that maybe we haven't touched upon yet is the role of auditors. The role of auditors within professionalization, because that is keeping maybe certain countries in advancing more if our auditors are not able to understand why this is important. And this is not just about punishing, but also providing the necessary means to improve capacities.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So that brings us very neatly to the end of the session. Thank you so much to our panelists for their insights and for everyone for their questions and what has been a really lively and active chat. So thank you all for your thoughts and insights. It is the summer, so POGO will be taking a break over July and August, but that means that your appetite should be whetted for the Social Outcomes Conference, which is the 8th and 9th of September and includes a procurement and social value theme. So back with a bang at the beginning of September. the programme is online. You can come to that online or in person. And if you're able to come in person, you can enjoy the challenge of meeting people who you've perhaps only ever seen in a little Zoom box and see if you can still recognise them. So hopefully we'll see lots of you at the conference and then back at regular POGO calls after that. So thank you very much, everyone, for your participation today. Great session. Well done, everybody.